All right, good morning. Welcome to another edition of the Forecast Contest Weekly Discussion. Today we're having it on Friday to accommodate some folks who can't normally make the meeting on Tuesday. All right, I'm going to start. I'm just going to pull up here the forecast. The forecast we made from March 24th. But before we get going into the forecast in terms of today's agenda, follow a similar format we normally do. We'll start with attribution, and we'll talk about also just a new product. I guess we added thanks to a student at Albany, Luke Waddell, and then we'll get into today's forecast. And we don't have any special or invited industry guests today, but you never know. Folks may jump on. But usually on days like today, we allow for more Q&A. And we can focus on just any questions folks have about, making a subseasonal forecast, things like that, especially if we have any beginners or new folks on the contest. Before we get into it, anything else anyone here wants to make sure we cover in today's call? Okay. All right, so let me just start off by mentioning, this new addition, I guess you could call it, under the archive. If you click on the performance charts, we have some new performance charts. We hope to be adding to this over time, but right now you have 2 rows of data, EC and CFS performance charts and correlation charts. Not great with names, but in terms of the top row, the performance charts here, I'll just highlight or mouse over. So what you see is the time evolution, and we break these out by season. So this is the current heating season starting from November and then ending almost near March 1st. These are initialized dates, right? So the dates the forecasts were made. The Y columns are HDD values. And in terms of what's plotted, we have the CFS in red, ECMWF in blue, the 10 and 30-year climatologies, and your observations. And these are for the 16 to 20-day forecasts up here. You can see subseasonal days 16 to 20. So there's a lot here, and I definitely encourage folks to kind of look through the different seasons and stuff. There's a lot of interesting stuff that just jumps out. But maybe I'll ask I don't know, Michael or someone there. 2 questions for you, Michael. Putting you on the spot. But first of all, do you understand how to interpret these charts? Any questions there? And 2, anything jump out to you? Anything interesting aspects about this current season?
As for chart interpretation, I think it's pretty straightforward. As for things jumping out, I'd say it's rather interesting that looks like there's 2 very obvious periods where the models completely missed on the warmth. Looks like December to almost January, and then January like 6th to like the 16th or so. They just completely missed on those 2 warm periods. It'd be interesting to see if we could. Maybe if someone has an idea as to why they might have missed those 2 warm periods. I mean, I guess it's 3 months ago now, so I don't know if anyone has any ideas on that, but Dave, I don't know if you're saying anything, but if you are, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. I just had it on mute. Sorry about that, guys. No, I was just saying, yeah, and I think exactly what Michael said is right. And then I think some of the other questions are just what the season to season. This season is so performance is so much worse than some of the previous years, and what's going on there, right? Like again, what was unique, I guess, about this season that model skill was so much lower. Yeah. So I know there's a lot here, and I just want to make sure folks are aware. You can, obviously look at this offline too. And I think hopefully not only could this be of use, for the contest, but in terms of making better forecasts and informing your forecast, but also inspiring new research studies, right? Like exactly what Michael said, maybe a case study into this December event, January event, or just the larger perspective, the macro perspective about what was different maybe, or unique, or however you want to look at it, about this season versus some of the previous seasons. Like, this year, why do we have a EC 0.7 correlation two winters ago, and this winter so far, a slightly negative correlation? I don't have an answer.
I'd also be interested in, oh, sorry, what the correlation is in the change from one period to the next. I see, for instance, if the CFS, let's say, from one period to the next increased the HGDs by 10 and the observations increased by 10, that would be, in that metric, a perfect, right on the one-to-one line.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to see what those kind of correlations look like as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it would be interesting to see how, like a bias corrected version of the EC and CFS also fare, right? Right. I mean, maybe the CFS was, perfectly correlated, minus, when you account for some sort of bias correction. I don't think that's the case, but it would be interesting to see how much improvement we get from some basic bias correction methods, things like Michael you're working on, and maybe some others. Okay, and there's Luke also has a write-up. Definitely encourage you to take a look at that. He provides some interesting analysis also on weighting schemes and looking at combinations of different models over these periods of time, like optimal weighting schemes, which of course is very relevant to what we do in the forecast contest. What should you weight each week? 90% EC, 10% CFS, etc. So there's some good stuff there too. Okay. All right, I will switch back to our standard sort of attribution. So the most recent verification we have is, let's see, not this week, yeah, this is it, right? Just make sure, yeah. So the most recent verification we have is from forecast from March 3rd, verifying March 18th to March 22nd. We can sort this. So Philip looks like was the big winner this week. So the verification was almost 88 HDDs. The 30-year average is, where's the 30-year average? Was 96, and the 10-year average was 91. So it was, a little bit warmer again than the 30 and 10-year averages. And Philip almost had a perfect score there, at least in terms of his mean forecast. Looks like the EC also did okay there. Industry, Dave, the two Daves there, slightly above. Looks like most of the forecast finished a little bit better than normal here, with a few exceptions. So, no, this is probably in the scheme of things one of our a good forecast for most folks here. Not looks like not too much in the way of a surprise that we've seen at times this year. Let's look real quick at the Dynacast. So again, this is the 18th to the 22nd. I'll just pull that up so we can see the pattern. Whoops. Here we go. So this pattern we've seen certainly this winter, with the ridge kind of holding strong in the southeast and the trough and colder weather up north. Let's take a quick look also at the Maxar's PDF. I think I can pull it up. What was that again? It was from the 3rd, right? Yeah. So March 3rd. Yeah, so this is the March 3rd forecast. So they definitely captured the southeast ridge and a little bit more, right? We actually verified some cool anomalies up across the north, but they definitely caught the ridge in the southeast. And here's the model guidance. Looks like in general, it looks like the guidance was just a little bit too aggressive. Let's see if we can put them closer together. Flip back and forth. There's the verification. So it looks like the 0 line was a little bit south of Chicago. Yeah, so it looks like these forecasts, at least from a pattern perspective, were too aggressive on the warmth. But I guess, you know, it's arguably, I guess it's in the ballpark, and certainly a little bit of a positive AO flavor there. Let me stop there for a second. Any thoughts in terms of this forecast verification, good, bad, or ugly, or any other insight into it? No? We're just looking at the AO, since we've talked a lot about the AO, and it looks like, yeah, the AO, at least through this forecast, was continued to be reliably positive, right? As we've seen, and Michael, you'll appreciate this. It continued to the models. It continued to defy the models, right? Again, another awesome research question from this winter, I think. Anyway, why do we continue to see more times than not the AO verify so far on the positive end of the forecast envelope, right? I mean, look at this. What's that? The 1 standard deviation or 2 standard deviation, is it? And it's verifying, you know, right for the last 2 weeks. It's verified, you know, near the top end of the forecast distribution. Open question as to why that is. All right. Any other thoughts on attribution? Not the most exciting week, maybe, before we switch gears and talk about the forecast.
The only thing I'll mention is I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think the CPC did really well this with this forecast, because I think they were fairly warm as well. Because I this week I changed my formula to kind of ignore more of the teleconnections and lean more towards the CPC that week. Because I remember the CPC was warm, and the teleconnections were giving me colder signals. Like I think I want to say the NAO and AO were on the colder, were trending towards the colder side, and I kind of ignored that that week, so to speak.
You know, you bring up an interesting point, though, to play contrarian there a little bit. Well, okay, I won't speak for CPC exactly because we don't have it up here. But, you know, when you look at the CFS and the EC forecast, on one hand, you're like, okay, maybe, well, I guess my point is, in particular with the CFS, you know, sometimes we talk about, hey, it's unusual for the CFS to go warm. But when it does, maybe that's a signal, right? Maybe that's the time where, oh my God, it's definitely going to be warm. It's really going to be warm. This was a case where no, that definitely was not the case. The CFS, especially from a pattern perspective, right, was ballistic warm, right? Or pretty warm. Pull that back up. Where did I have it up? So this one? Did I close it already?
I think it was further to the left.
Let me just open it. There we go. Yeah, I mean, the CFS was, from a pattern perspective, I mean, it was extremely warm. Remember, the zero line was south and east of Chicago, right? It had a big bullseye. So, and from a numbers perspective, right? What was it again? 78.6. You put in a bias correction on that CFS, you're probably down at 65, right? 60 or whatever, depending on exactly what bias you're using. So I feel like the CFS was actually, in some respects, did not do a good job if you were using it. Not that you were saying this exactly, Michael. You triggered a thought with the CFS that this was definitely not a case where, just because the CFS was warm, that, oh, well, it's highlighting potentially a really warm forecast. The actual verification, remember, was a little bit north of what a lot of folks expected, right? The 87.9. I should have put a lot, but it was there was definitely a split, right? And with the CFS and EC a little bit warmer than it. So again, just bottom line, I feel like the CFS, and especially if you bias corrected the CFS, it didn't necessarily give you a good forecast for this period. Anyone have any other thoughts on that, on the CFS or EC model performance this period? Am I being too harsh?
Well, I'd toss out as just to play here a little bit that if you were, let's say you had a 10 HDD bias correction for the CFS, which I think is a bit too low, but if you did go with that, you'd be, let's say you bias corrected at 10 degrees when it was too cold and 10 degrees when it was too warm. If you thought it was too warm this week or that particular week, you could have bias corrected it up 10 degrees and you would have been in the same area as the EC. So technically, if you look at it like that, it didn't do too badly.
Yeah, but if you bias corrected the CFS this week, it would have been even warmer, right?
Well, no, I'm saying you bias corrected the other way because you thought it would be too warm to begin with.
Yeah, but
it depends on your threshold. Yeah, I mean, it depends on what threshold you have as being too warm. Which is kind of, I guess, arbitrary, but I mean, you could technically use if it's above the 30-year, it's too cold. If it's below, it's too warm. There's a couple of ways you could do it.
I mean, yeah, that's an interesting idea. So I was just working from the premise that again, let's pretend it's 3 weeks ago or whatever, and all you have is information like this. The CFS bias is, let's say, 15, and the EC bias is about 8. So I think all things being equal, right? If you felt like the bias correction added value, you might take away 15 from the CFS and take away 8 from the EC, assuming you were applying the bias correction, assuming that previous metrics had showed you. But I think what you're saying, and I think this is interesting to look at, is that there could be a conditional bias correction that, and I think it's worth looking into. I don't know the answer to it exactly, but that the bias correction for the CFS may be different depending on on the type of forecast. So if the CFS is forecasting something well above HDD normals, like a really cold forecast, right? It's forecasting really cold. The bias applied to that may be different than if it's forecasting a very warm forecast. Is that what you're saying, or suggesting?
Basically, there's different ways you could do that. Mine, the one I suggested was kind of just take the basic bias correction number or whatever number you choose, it doesn't really matter, and just kind of add or subtract based on whether or not you think it's too warm or too cold, which you could be, which is arbitrary, whether you think it's too warm or too cold, really. But I think, I mean, I don't know this for sure, but usually I think when the CFS predicts it to be warmer, usually, maybe, and I could be wrong about this, it seems that it ends up being too warm almost. And except for like that one forecast where it actually got it right. So I wonder if that is in fact the case, is there, like, would such a bias correction actually work if you could predict when it's too warm or too cold?
Yeah, I think, Michael, I think with some of the work that you're doing already, it might not be, see if you can put that on your list, because I think it would only take a couple tweaks from what you've already done to be able to test that, right? Because I know you're doing EC, but I guess the same concept could apply with the EC. You've got, let's say, 50 EC forecasts, and as long as you have the normals, you can then separate the cold from the warm, right? And you could test your theory and see if there's a different type of bias, statistically, visually, whatever. If the bias changes, conditioned on whether it's a cold forecast or warm forecast, I think it'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think
right?
I could look into that.
Yeah. I think that's the only change you need to make. Take that one group and make it into two groups. I mean, at least that's where you could start. And that's where I definitely start. You could subcondition more, but you're going to run into sample size issues. So just at a very basic level, if you've got a CFS 50 forecasts, I'm just making this up, and the bias for those 50 forecasts is plus 10 HDDs, right? Subset it by the 25 that are cold, or whatever it is, colder than normal, or maybe it's subset it, however, but kind of break it in half. Let's say the 25 coldest, the 25 warmest, and see if that bias value changes materially. Let us know what you find. I think it'd be interesting analysis.
Yep.
Anyone have any other thoughts on that, or anything else before we get to the forecast? Has anyone looked at that? I don't know who's on the line right now, but Dr. Decker, anyone have any reason to believe we should expect, change in the bias conditioned on the forecast?
I have not looked into anything like that. I suppose if there was some, if the ice albedo feedback, especially in the winter time, was being handled improperly by the model, I could see maybe there being some conditionality on pre-existing biases or feeding on themselves in certain circumstances, but I have not looked into it myself.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? Like, if it does work out, it could, if it does occur, it could be because there's some other, right? There's a condition there that only occurs in one situation, that like snow albedo or snow cover, right? Let's say anomalous snow cover typically feeds back into a colder forecast and bad forecast. Then you tend to see that. This is just a theory, right? That so in the colder forecast, it kind of feeds back on itself because there's snow cover, and then it feeds back into the forecast, and so you get these really bad errors. Whereas when the CFS is forecasted warm, that typically is associated with forecasts where there's not as much snow cover, and so you don't get as much systematic error with that. But you don't know until you look at the until you do the analysis. So I guess we'll see. All right, cool. All right, we'll switch to forecast. You can't avoid it, right? It's always more fun and easier to do a little bit of Monday morning quarterback, right? All right, but this forecast we don't know the answer to yet. So this is the forecast we just published from earlier in the week, March 24th, for April 8th, April 12th. So I'll just give a quick review. Looks like Yeah, we've got an interesting distribution here, that's for sure. Someone's going to be right, someone's going to be wrong, or maybe we'll all be wrong, who knows. But the CFS is the coldest forecast. So the CFS back to its rightful place as the coldest forecast here. And Michael, on the other end of the spectrum, with the warmest forecast at 50, almost 55, 56 HDDs. So we've got a wide spectrum here of forecasts. And it's interesting. I'm just going to bring up one other point, and I'll hand it over to you guys to talk about your forecast. Looking at today's, let me pull it up here. Looking at today's, like the next 15 days, I guess. There's a lot of, well, from an HDD perspective, there's quite a difference between the models. Here, let me pull it up in a different way. So we've looked at this a couple times, but just a reminder, this is the strip or the time series of HDDs from today out to day 15. And from left to right, you've got the official Maxar forecast. So this is their forecast over here. And then you've got, since I clicked on the EC Ensemble, we're looking at the EC Ensemble forecast from most recent to a couple days back. And the 0Z is the one I want you to look at because that's the last full strip. The 60 is only out 6 days or so. And you can see the total, you can see it's color coded by warm and kind of cool. And it's kind of a mix, and you get a 15-day number of 225. Normals over here, it's 229, so it's slightly below the 30-year normal. And worth noting that Maxar bias corrects by about 20, or whatever correction they're using, they're about 20 HDs warmer. But okay, that's the EC. Now take a quick look at the GFS. Boom. You can look at the 60 too, but if you want to look apples to apples, the 0Z, a lot colder, so 245 HDDs versus, what do we say, like the EC was 220 or 225?
225, yeah.
225, so about 20 HDDs colder than the EC, and about 40 HDDs colder than the Maxar official forecast here. So there's definitely some differences even within this window in terms of what's going to happen here the next couple of weeks, if you believe the GFS. Some of those forecasts, Michael's forecast is going to be way too cool. Then again, if you buy where Maxar is going with it and a little bit of the EC, Michael's forecast could be absolutely spot on here with a really warm outcome, warmer than the 30-year, at least, when you aggregate that up for a 5-day period, and persist that out, you could definitely be up near Michael's number. So some interesting scenarios here, even just the next couple of weeks. But with that, let's turn it over to folks here. Who wants to kick us off and give us a breakdown of the forecast?
Well, I've got the warmest, so I might as well go first.
Go for it. All right.
All right, so this week my forecast was 55.7 HDDs with a normal spread of 15.7, which is a bit warmer than the 30-year. No changes in the formula this week, same as it's always been for the past, I guess, 6 months now. So the main idea in my formula or my thinking this week was the CPC was incredibly warm, showing that southeastern ridge really starting to push its way north into most of the CONUS. You can see there 60% swath of warmth going up into Minnesota even for above average, 55% going through New York. So a lot of the late season HDD producers are supposed to be above average based off of this map. As for the teleconnections, this is where things got a little spooky, so to speak. So the AO, as Dave mentioned, is supposed to be heading towards neutral and even towards negative during the forecast period. But as Dave also already pointed out, We've been verifying at the upper end of guidance, and even on today, you can see there's a disconnect between the forecast and what actually happened. So I think it's the same way with the NAO forecast to be pretty strongly negative. I think strongest negative since just check real quick. It's wrong day. Where is it? 1 second. Yeah, the strongest negative going back, I guess, since November. So pretty strongly negative forecast there. But like I said, it's also been verifying above. It hasn't been verified. It's been verifying pretty positive. Heck, the correlation is less than half or less than 0.5. So I think that's really bad for a correlation to be less than half or 0.5, I should say. So I treated those both as verifying on the warmer side, just because that's how it's always verified. Same thing with the AO, not the AO, the PNA, which has been verifying. It's been positive most of the time, or negative most of the time, and it's claiming that it'll get back to neutral or slightly positive, and based on past experience, that the past few weeks it's been on the negative end of guidance, the lower ends. I figured that'll stay still slightly negative. So if there's any cold, I think it'll probably be on the West Coast, similar to what the CPC is showing. As for some risks to the forecast, as I finish my rant here, obviously, if the NAO and AO actually do verify to that level of actually getting to negative, that would more than likely mean we'd get some chillier weather up in the Northeast, which would help push down those HCD values into probably closer towards the 30-year normal rather than as warm as I'm showing it to be. So that is my spiel for the day. Any questions?
I mean, on my end, like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to challenge you as a jerky private sector, but I guess I'm a little bit biased here because now looking at the numbers, my forecast is not that far from yours. But I think there's some rationale there. I mean, with the AO and things like that, and I mean, it's a compelling signal. And I know I always hate to play the game of I guess I don't have a lot of questions other than, I guess my point is I think some of your rationale there is pretty good. I think there's justification, obviously, in my mind, to have kind of a warm forecast today. I think it's consistent. It's in the ballpark anyway of the industry and stuff like that. And I think because of your rationale, because of the AO and the compelling situation of the AO, and I think frankly, when you look at the models, even in the 11 to 15, I'll just pull it up real quick. Here's the 11 to 15 getting out to day 15. It's even the GFS, which is the quote unquote cold model. It's not exactly a super. It doesn't even look that cold. And I think if you apply a little bit of a bias here, correction, all of a sudden you could have a swath of a lot of warmth coming across the middle part of the country. So I think bottom line is with the bias that we've seen this winter so far, not every week as we saw last week, but I think the CFS 15 CDDs, EC 10 HDDs, or whatever it is. I think there's a lot of data to maintain a warm forecast. I guess I guess there's a question here that I'll ask a question for you, Michael, before we move on. And the nice thing, again, without a lot of industry folks and small group, we can we can stay on topics for a while. But, I guess, and I think we've asked this question before, but I guess we have to keep asking it. I think we have to keep asking it until someone has an answer, and that may never happen. But so let's go back to this AO thing, right? Let me pull that back up. Where did I have that? Let's pull up the AO chart so we can talk about that. So here, oh yeah, that is PNA. Okay, so maybe we don't know the answer exactly in terms of the why, but at what point do we stop? Does that bias, does that stop in the spring? Does it stop in the summer? Should we expect it to stop in the summer? Should we start to weight it less? Even if we come in here, well, like right now, but let's also play this forward a week and 2 weeks from now, it's mid and late April, and we see the same exact, pattern here where it's verifying near the top. At some point, do we say, well, we're looking at the May forecast, and despite the fact that it's been this way for 4 months, we shouldn't apply this because we're applying it to a different season and there's not a good rationale to do it? I mean, like, any thoughts on that? Any thoughts as to how strong and how long we can ride this signal will persist?
Well, see, my thought process with, at least with the regards to the AO, is that it kind of loses a little bit of its importance as you get into late spring, early summer months, where other teleconnections gain a little bit, I won't say more importance than in the winter, but they're more important than the AO, I would say. Since once the polar vortex breaks down, I think it's supposed to break down in the next few weeks or so. The AO won't really. I don't. And correct me if I'm wrong here. And I think this is the case. That the AO doesn't really have as much significance as, say, if you had a strongly negative NAO forecast. Now, and to kind of maybe anticipate your next question, would I do the same thing with the NAO and the PNA, with their verifications being more positive and more negative, respectively? That I would say that unless the trend changed significantly leading up to the next few weeks, where it's been, either more positive or more negative than the forecast, then I would say I would keep using the same. I guess I'll use the term bias correction for these teleconnections. Eyeballing bias correction that I've been using, just because if the models show me that they don't make any adjustment or whatever's causing them to miss doesn't change when we get to I guess May, then I don't see why it would change when we get to June. It could very well. I don't really. I'm not a wizard. I don't. I can't see that far into the future, but you know, but overall, I would say that I wouldn't change how I look at the teleconnections, unless the model showed me that there was a reason to change how I look at the teleconnections, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I know it's a difficult question, right? One of the things we might be able to look at, and I think it's a great investigate. I mean, you just look at this past winter, and I think, I would imagine there's going to be a lot of studies by a lot of groups to look at what was special about the AO this winter. But I think one of the things we might be able to do too to address some of those, this is where like reforecasts and looking at some historical years, right? It'd be great to even just look at other seasons and say, hey, in other seasons where the AO had a dramatic bias in the winter, did it persist into the spring and summer, right? And when did it break down? And then I think you alluded to this a little bit, saying something about the stratospheric vortex. I think some other folks on the call in the past have mentioned that maybe it's linked to the strat vortex as a physical feature, and so as soon as that becomes less of an influence and stuff. So I think there's some interesting aspects there. The last thing about this I just wanted to bring up, it's kind of related. I can't speak to this in terms of forecast bias, but I can speak to it. We can look at it through these values here in terms of actual observation. And winters about 10 years ago, the winters of like 2009, the years of 2009, 10 into the beginning of 11. What I remember about those years was there was we're looking at AO monthly values now. I know it's hard to read, but looking from January to December. So January's 0.81, February's 0.93, did I say that right? March, April, so on and so forth. So January to December from left to right, and then there's years. And what you saw starting in 2009 is, I think, what is still, since 1950, the most unprecedented consecutive period of negative AO values. And I think NAO followed very similarly. You basically had, starting in the summer, negative values. The winter of 2009-10 was phenomenally negative NAO. Just look at these values, they're unbelievable. Into 2010, basically continuing almost without exception. There's 1 month there with 11 out of 12 months, negative AO into 2010. And then into the 2011 and into that summer before finally the changing leading up into the winter of 2011-12, which turned out to be, at the time anyway, I think the warmest winter on record, and the AO did a massive flip. But my point is that we had a stretch there of 2.5 years where the AO was negative in almost every month, not just winter months, right? So whatever was driving that AO signal, or at least in part, what was driving it was something that went beyond seasonal signals, right? Not that there weren't seasonal contributions, but clearly there was something that was going on that was bigger than just seasonal contributions. And that reminded me of sort of the question that we're asking when we look at what's going on in the current event and the fact that the AO has been so positive, putting aside the model bias, but just putting the fact that we've had such a positive AO for most of this winter. Is whatever's driving it, is it going to continue into the spring and summer, or unlike those years, is there more of a seasonal component to it? So, any other thoughts on that before we switch on to maybe Dr. Decker?
None from me.
Well, actually, I did make a forecast this week since my routine is all screwed up, and I didn't get around to making a forecast, so there's nothing for me to.
Okay.
If I had made a forecast, it would just be the CPC forecast, but
right.
But I don't really have anything to add this week.
Okay. I don't think there's too many folks on the line today. If anyone else is on that wants to go, just feel free to jump on. But my forecasts, I don't have a lot to add other than what we've already said. My formula is down here. I didn't change it much. The main, my formula has been relatively consistent. I try to, through some subjective/objective analysis, trying to tweak the formula, trying to come up with something that works well. But again, there's a good amount of subjectivity into it. And then if I added my bias correction value, again, it's a blend of subjective and quantitative information. But what I referred to was, the heating season biases from the EC and CFS, and I tried to take, and I looked at the 30 days, I looked at the longer term, and both I think have been relatively consistent, at least in terms of the directional signal. The strength has changed some, but the CFS 9 here in the 30 days, the EC, somewhere close to 10 for both of them, and then in the of course, going to the start of the season, it's more like 15 to 10, 15 for the CFS. So I felt like we're still in the heating season. I mean, we are technically in the heating season, although we are coming out of it. So I felt, pretty comfortable, I guess you could say, in applying that, a bias correction to my values. Beyond that, and that's effectively how I came out with that 59. And then, just kind of looking at it more subjectively, and this kind of we already talked about. You already kind of heard me kind of tipping my cap. I just I guess I'm more concerned going down the radiant view here, Maxar view, that there's more risk that the warmer outcomes are going to again come through than the colder outcomes here. And again, that's just more subjective, but just looking at the pattern here and looking at some of the the AO things we've talked about, and looking just in my own interpretation of the 500 millibar heights in the 610, 11 to 15, it doesn't scream out to me to be something that's on the verge of breaking cold. Looks like I just felt like there was more risk of warm, so felt comfortable in that. Maybe just let's take a quick look at the MJO, because we haven't talked about that too much. Sorry about the background noise. Joys of working from home, right? See if I can pull that up. Look at the snapshot here. I think we're in phase 3 and 4. Yeah, kind of 3 and 4, and kind of moving toward, well, it's in a kind of a blunted circuit if it happens that way. But in theory, I guess a weak signal into phases 6, 7, maybe 8, or maybe 7 and 8, 1 if you expand this out. We could take a look. I always like looking at, I think it's Caitlin's site. She put together a really nice site here. I like this site because it looks at things at a 10-day aggregate, and in particular in the shoulder seasons, things can move around quite a bit, and it's good to at least know that, right? Yeah, even if it doesn't give you a strong coherent signal, the fact that if you toggle back and forth that you don't see a coherent signal, that gives you a lot of information in itself in terms of the fact that there it might not be a good signal to pick up on. All right, so we can look into April here, kind of get into late April. So looking at the 7 and 8 signals, again, I like toggling back and forth just to see if there's consistency. So that's phase 7. Let's just look at, we'll go phase 6, 7, and 8, 6, 7, and 8. I guess 8 starts to get cold, but 6 and 7, especially 7, looks pretty warm. The 6 looks warm there too if you just go to the April 21st, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, it looks like there's a consistent theme here that 6, 7 kind of on the warm side, and then as you get to 8, and I'll go up to 1, I assume that's cold too. Yeah. So it looks like if we get into phases 8 and in particular 1 at the end of this period, we'll have a better chance for cold. And if we stay more 6, 7, then it would end on the warmer. Again, if you're in the camp of using the MJO to try to hedge your forecast a little bit, it looks like that's the concern.
I have a question about those composites that you were just showing. Do they include
sure.
When the points are inside the circle, or only? Oh, there it is. Amplitude greater than 1.
Oh yeah.
So I noticed that a lot of the ensemble members are not amplitude greater than 1. So it'd be interesting to have a 9th plot here where what's the signal when there is amplitude less than 1 of any phase or something like that. Is there a signal? The lack of a strong MJO may itself be some sort of signal, I suppose.
That's a good point, and just based on our, let's see, do I have it up here somewhere? I got too many things open. Maybe I don't have it open. I was going to see if we had our MJO plot. Oh, here. Oh, it's not. Oh, I didn't run my. If I do this, do it later. But just on our MJO phase diagram thing, if I had it up here, I think the one that Dr. Decker you helped work on.
Right.
I think in general we do see that the signals get a little bit stronger as you get outside of the circle, right? there's sort of a sweet spot, right? Because then at some point you run into a sample size kind of issue. But it seemed like the moderate, strong signals tend to have, events tend to have stronger signals. So I suspect that's what we would see. Yeah. All right, cool. That's all I had. Does anyone else want to? We have a few minutes. We don't have to stay on here. But is there anything else that comes to mind that folks want to discuss before we end the call?
One thing I'll add real quick is going from the phase 6 to phase 1, if I'm reading this map correctly, it looks to me like that actually is predicting a negative NAO building in. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
I agree.
I guess you and I might have to sweat a little bit if that NAO does actually build in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, but it's funny. I almost mentioned that too because I was looking at it too, and my first reaction was, yeah, but yes, that's one way to look at it. Definitely, what you said, Michael. The other way to look at it is this could be further evidence that cold scenario is unlikely to verify. Like again, I'm using some subjectivity here, but if you go with the kind of follow a scenario here where the AO, there's something going on here that's making it very difficult for the AO to go positive, i.e. that the risk that even if we get into a phase 8-1 event, it is less likely than normal than the historical composites would show, then what you're seeing right there is not the most likely outcome. That there's less risk because we're already on a path which is going to make it much more difficult to actually realize the trigger in that composite which made it cold. And so, in other words, if you pull out that AO signal, how does the temperature pattern look? It probably looks a lot warmer. Now, again, I'm using a lot of subjective flavor here, and it would be really interesting. The way to more objectively test my theory would be, and we could do this. Again, we could do a lot of stuff, right? But a way to do it even without models is to, well, there's a couple different ways, but one of the ways we could do is, what would you call it? I'm trying to think of the best way, like a path analysis. So in both scenarios, you end up with a AO. You end up in phase 1, let's say, right? So 20 days from now, you're going to be in phase 1, both scenarios, right? You assume that to be a fact. You grab all historical events where you have a phase 1. Then you trace back 20 days, 15, 20 days, whatever it is, from those phase 1 events. And you break them into 2 groups, maybe more than 2, but let's just say 2, just to make it simple. One is where the initial conditions you were initialized as negative AO or whatever, and the other where you were initialized where we are today, which is very positive AO, right? And the argument there is to see, does the current base state influence your outcome 20 days later? And maybe you put, you could do a couple other conditional things there. Maybe you have something conditional, not just about the initial AO state, but something about the AO state over a longer period. Because, I think the argument that I'm trying to make here is not just that you're in a synoptically driven positive AO event. And if I just did that analysis exactly how I say, you flip back and forth across seasons. Sometimes you're negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive. It could just be coincidence that we pick the 20-day period that's just going through a synoptic event. No. We want to capture this whole thing, right? So we want to capture a signal that says, hey, if you are in a low pass kind of pattern where you're generally positive, then you're going into 20 days later, a phase 1 event. Does that change the outcome? So that is one, we could test it, but that's my theory. Any thoughts?
It definitely seems like that would be a worthwhile thing to look into.
It would be really cool to condition, right? That would be a neat thing to add to our MJO toolbox so far, right? It does, because a lot of even the experts here, they bring it up, right? They'll say things about, well, Jason Lin I think, has spent a lot of time over calls over the last few weeks, talking about how the MGO maybe didn't behave as a canonical or typical MGO because of this, that, and the other thing, because it behaved erratically or differently because of certain conditions in the Pacific or something. So
Right.
it would be interesting to see if we can find look at MGO response condition on different background states. I don't know, that kind of thing. Okay. All right. Well, I'll give you guys back 3 minutes of the rest of your day, right?
Well, actually, I had one
Oh,
more
yeah, go ahead.
thing.
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
don't know if anyone has looked into. So, with the economy shut down, I've seen things about there's less aerosols and air pollution and such, and I'm wondering if that's might lead to the temperatures being slightly warmer than the models would assume they would be, and is that some sort of correction that we should be taking into account in these forecasts? Maybe it's only a few tenths of an HDD, but is it something that we should be considering?
That's a really interesting point. I did see something. I can share this. Let's see if I can share this with at least you guys here. I'm going to send this out. Hold on one second. Where did I put it? I saw something right here. Let's send this out. Decker, Michael. I just saw. I just sent it to you guys, so you'll have it in a couple seconds. On Albany has a thread, the weather department there, and they folks post different things. And I just sent you a post there. Someone posted about the fact that there's because of the drop in air flights, global flights, and so because of that reduction in observations, that we could expect, or some folks are theorizing that there could be a drop in forecast skill. So I think that's and then of course what you mentioned, Dr. Decker, which is a different thing too. I mean, just how maybe just changes in the atmosphere too, radical changes in the atmosphere over a short period of time could also influence the models. I just speculating just based on those couple of thoughts. I would think, in particular, with the loss of observations, and I haven't investigated this thoroughly, but that I would err on it's either going to be the same or worse, right? It's not going to be better. So that could be a potential problem for the 16 to 20. And actually, I guess, so how do you address that? I guess one way is you open up your distribution and you put more weight on normal. Just sort of a random forecast. I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
Hey, Dave, this is Dave D'Arcangelo.
Oh, hey, Dave.
Hey, sorry, I jumped in real late. I was busy with something else. Can you include me on that distribution as well?
Sure.
I'm interested to see it.
Sure.
Thank you.
And Dave, since you jumped on, do you have any other thoughts? I thought that was a great question by Dr. Decker asking about should we expect a deterioration of forecast skill here?
I guess the short answer is I don't know, but it's really a compelling question. I think there's two sides, as you pointed out. One is the forecast skill component, and then one is the actualization of surface observations. So we're going to potentially be able to test both over time. It's likely that the economic carnage will be severe and could be somewhat long lasting. So this isn't, the only thing I can recall would be, we saw how clean the air became, the week following 9/11. Here we are 2 decades hence. This is a different situation on a vastly different time scale, and this one is global. That one was more North America. So I don't know. I just this is not an area of specialty for me in terms of like atmospheric aerosols, and surface impacts. But it'll be fascinating to watch potentially unfold. And I saw there was I don't know if there was related, but there was something that was batted around Twitter, maybe yesterday or the day before. Most of Twitter is garbage, but that was something that was fairly insightful.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. I actually have to leave it there. I have to jump on another meeting. But Dave, I'll definitely send you over that email thread. Yeah, and if anyone sees anything else from that, please share it, and we'll try to also share it with the rest of the forecast contest group. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. And by the way, next week I think we're going to go back to our Tuesday schedule. So we'll have the forecast discussion I think at 9:30 Tuesday morning. All right. We'll see you guys.
Great.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Dave.
See ya.
Take care.
All right. Bye, guys.